In the flat, sun-bleached grasslands of West Texas, there is a ranch that no longer appears on any modern map by the name it once carried. Between 1880 and 1885, 30 men who worked its fences and cattle drives vanished. Not all at once, but one by one, in a slow bleeding that took 5 years to notice as a pattern. No bodies, no struggle, no note. And then, on a spring morning in 1885, one of them walked back through the gate. He was alive, he was unharmed, and he remembered nothing, not his name, not his family, not a single day of the years he had been gone. To this day, historians, folklorists, and true crime researchers cannot agree on what happened on that ranch. This is the story of the men who disappeared, the one who came back, and a mystery the state of Texas has never closed. The ranch sat 40 miles from the nearest town, close enough to matter to the county's tax rolls and far enough to be forgotten by anyone who didn't have business there. It stretched across a wide, dry basin where the grass grew thin and silver green in spring and burned to the color of old rope by July, cut through by 2 seasonal creeks that ran full for 6 weeks a year and nothing but cracked mud for the rest. Its owner, a hard, quiet man who had built his herd from nothing, from a single small inheritance and a decade of decisions other men would have called reckless, ran the kind of operation that swallowed hired hands the way the land swallowed rain. Men came for a season, took their pay, and moved on to the next outfit down the trail. That was the rhythm of the frontier, and everyone who worked it understood the terms. So when the first 2 vanished in the spring of 1880, no one thought much of it. Ranch hands disappeared all the time, for all the ordinary reasons men disappear. They drank too much in the wrong town and woke up in a jail cell 3 counties over, too embarrassed to write home. They rode off with another man's wife or another man's daughter and were never seen again by anyone who knew their real name. They took a better offer 40 miles south, heard about a bigger outfit paying better wages, and didn't bother sending word because sending word cost a stamp, and most men who left that way weren't sentimental about the jobs they'd quit. The rancher noted the absence in his ledger, a single line, a date, a name crossed through, deducted their unpaid wages against whatever they owed the company store, and hired 2 more men off the next cattle drive that passed through. This was simply how the labor worked. Nobody kept close track of a drifting cowhand because drifting was the job. By the following winter, 3 more were gone. Then 2 more in the spring of 1881. The rancher, a practical man who trusted numbers more than feelings, a man who could tell you the weight of every steer on his property without stepping on a scale, began to notice that the math didn't add up the way ordinary turnover usually added up. Men who quit or drifted away typically left a trail behind them, however faint. They left debts unpaid at the bunkhouse card table. They left horses unclaimed in the corral, tack they hadn't bothered to collect, a boot left behind because its mate had worn through first. Some left letters half-written to mothers or sweethearts, abandoned mid-sentence when a better offer came along. These men left nothing. No bedroll gone missing from the bunkhouse, no horse unaccounted for beyond the one they'd been riding when they vanished. No note, no debt collection, no story anyone could piece together after the fact from what they'd left in their wake. It was as if they had walked out the bunkhouse door on an ordinary evening and simply stepped off the edge of the earth, taking nothing with them, because there had been no time, no warning, no decision to leave at all. He rode into town, a half-day's journey each way, and reported it to the county sheriff, a man with exactly 1 deputy, a single jail cell, and roughly 300 square miles of jurisdiction to patrol on a budget that barely covered horseshoes. The sheriff listened, nodded slowly, and told him what every rancher in that part of Texas already knew in his bones. Men vanish. It is the nature of the frontier, the sheriff said, and he wasn't being callous. He was stating a fact that both men had built their working lives around. Unless there was a body, there was no provable crime, and without a provable crime, There was no investigation to formally open, no budget to justify sending his one deputy out on a 40-mile ride to search empty grassland for a hand who'd probably turn up drunk in Abilene within the month. The rancher rode home with nothing but the same uneasy feeling he'd arrived with. And if you have ever run a business, employed people, or managed something you couldn't fully see with your own eyes every hour of the day, you know that feeling. It is the sense that something is wrong long before you have a single fact that would let you prove it to another person. The low hum of a ledger that doesn't balance even when every number on the page is technically correct. Among those first 11 names, a handful stand out even in the sparse record that survives. There was a young man named Curtis Boyle, barely 19, who had written home to his mother in Georgia every single month without fail for the 2 years he'd worked the ranch, describing the size of the sky and the strangeness of a land with no trees to speak of. Until, in the autumn of 1881, the letters simply stopped mid-correspondence, with no final goodbye and no explanation, leaving his mother to write increasingly frantic letters of her own to a sheriff's office that had no answer to give her. There was an older hand, a man in his 50s, known only by the nickname Dutch in every surviving record, who had worked cattle across 4 states and told the younger men he'd seen every kind of trouble the frontier had to offer, and who vanished on a routine ride to check a windmill pump, leaving behind nothing but the half-eaten breakfast still cooling on his plate in the bunkhouse. These were not reckless men, not drifters with nothing to lose. They were, by every account available, ordinary working men with mothers who wrote to them and habits that suggested lives they intended to keep living. By 1882, the number had reached 11, and that was when the whispers started, not in town, where the story was still just a curiosity traded over coffee, but among the men still working the ranch itself, the ones who woke up every morning and rode out onto the same grass where their friends had last been seen. Something out on the North Range, they said to each other in low voices near the bunkhouse stove. Something in the arroyos where the cattle wouldn't graze, where even the coyotes seemed to give a wide berth on their nightly circuits. Nobody would name it directly, not at first. Frontier men had their pride, and admitting fear of empty grassland was not a thing easily said aloud among people who prided themselves on fearing nothing the land could throw at them. But the behavior told the story, their words wouldn't. Fewer and fewer men would take shifts riding fence past the northern boundary alone. Requests to be paired up on that stretch of the property, requests that would have been laughed out of the bunkhouse 2 years earlier, became quiet, common, and increasingly non-negotiable. The rancher noticed this too, the way he noticed every operational detail of his business, and he began, quietly, without admitting it even to his own wife, to avoid sending anyone out to that section alone, not because he believed the whispers, but because a workforce that believed something was out there became unreliable in ways a rancher couldn't afford. Whether he believed there was truly something out on the North Range, or whether he simply understood that 11 missing men in 2 years was a pattern no rational explanation had yet accounted for, the historical record does not tell us. What it does tell us is that by the end of 1882, he had begun, for the first time, keeping notes of his own. Not yet the full journal that would later become the only surviving primary account of the entire ordeal, but scattered entries in the back pages of his cattle ledger, dates and names pressed in beside tallies of livestock, as if some part of him had already begun treating his missing men the way he treated his missing stock, as losses to be recorded, even if they could not yet be explained. The rancher did what any man losing his workforce and his reputation in equal measure would eventually do. He organized a search, and he did it properly, at real expense, because by 1882, the whispers among his own hands had made clear that half measures would only accelerate the exodus of labor he could not afford to lose. This was not the frantic, disorganized searching of a single missing person case. It was methodical, funded out of his own pocket, and planned the way he planned everything else on the ranch, with lists, timetables, and a clear-eyed accounting of cost against expected results. He hired trackers, several of whom had worked seasons for the Texas Rangers, and carried the kind of frontier expertise that could read a week-old hoof print the way another man reads a newspaper headline. He paid for 2 full weeks of daylight, horses, supplies, and their time, and sent them combing through every arroyo, every dry creek bed, every cave mouth and rock overhang within a 20-mile radius of the property line, with special and repeated attention to the northern range that his own men had grown so reluctant to work. They found old campfires, long cold, left by hunting parties or travelers passing through years earlier. They found coyote dens tucked into the banks of dry washes. They found the bleached, sun-cracked bones of cattle that had wandered off from the herd the way cattle always eventually do, dying of thirst or misadventure in the ordinary, explainable way that livestock dies on the open range. They found not one trace of a single missing man, not a boot heel, not a scrap of cloth caught on mesquite thorns, not a bone that a doctor, however unofficially credentialed, could identify as human rather than animal, and no trackers, however skilled, however many seasons they had spent reading trails across country far more difficult than this flat basin, can follow a trail that was never laid down in the first place. That absence, the complete, total absence of any physical evidence whatsoever, became its own kind of evidence, unsettling in a way that a grim discovery might almost have been easier to sit with. In a land where a missing man usually left something behind, however small, boot prints heading in a direction, a struggle flattening the grass, a dropped hat snagged on brush, these men left the kind of silence that unsettles even hardened frontiersmen who had spent careers reading the smallest signs the land offered up. One tracker, according to an account passed down through a rancher's family for 3 generations and later recorded by a regional folklorist in the 1950s, refused his payment outright and rode off the property before nightfall on the final day of the search, saying only, when pressed, that some ground doesn't want to be searched, and that he would rather ride home a poor man than sleep another night on that section of the range. Whether this was superstition, exhaustion, or something else entirely, no written account has ever clarified. The man himself is not known to have spoken of it publicly again in the years that followed, and his identity, beyond a surname recorded secondhand, has been lost to the historical record. By 1883, the rumors circulating in the nearby town had hardened from vague unease into 2 competing theories, and both spread through the county the way strange stories always travel in small, isolated communities, faster than any verified fact ever could. The first theory held that the men were being deliberately picked off by a criminal outfit, perhaps a band of horse thieves operating out of the rougher country to the west, or possibly a rival cattle operation attempting to cripple the ranch's productivity by draining its labor supply one man at a time, killing or press-ganging hands so gradually that the losses would look like ordinary turnover rather than a coordinated campaign. This theory had the advantage of being rational, explicable in terms the frontier already understood. Rustling, sabotage, and range wars were not unheard of in that era, and a competitor patient enough to bleed a rival dry over years rather than months was, if nothing else, a comprehensible kind of villain. The second theory was stranger, and for exactly that reason it traveled faster and lodged deeper in the local imagination. Older residents of the county, some with roots going back generations to Spanish and Mexican land grants that predated Texas statehood, others who had lived for decades alongside indigenous communities with far longer histories on that specific stretch of land, spoke of the northern range as ground that had always taken things long before this rancher or his cattle had ever arrived. Ground where, they said, the land itself kept a tally that predated any ledger a settler might keep. Cattle refused to graze near a certain dry wash on the northern boundary, veering wide around it even when better grass grew closer to that spot than anywhere else on the property. Dogs, normally fearless around livestock and strangers alike, would not cross a specific low ridge line without their hackles rising and a low, uncertain growl building in their throats. Whether this was superstition dressed up as memory, passed down and embellished across generations until it hardened into folklore, or memory dressed up as superstition, an old, practical warning about a genuinely dangerous stretch of ground, reframed over time into something more mysterious because the original reason for avoiding it had been lost. No one could say for certain. And the honest answer, more than a century later, is that we still can't say for certain either. What we do know, from surviving fragments, is that by the end of 1883, the ranch had lost 18 men in total, and the rancher, increasingly desperate to solve a problem that was actively bleeding his business dry, increasingly isolated from neighbors who had begun to whisper about him as much as about his ranch, and increasingly disbelieved by a county government that had no framework for investigating a crime with no body and no evidence, had begun keeping a private journal in earnest. Every disappearance was recorded, the date, the man's full name where it was known, his last assigned task before vanishing, and curiously and consistently, the weather that day, as if some part of him suspected, without being able to articulate why, that the conditions of the sky itself might eventually turn out to matter. That journal, or the fragments believed to have been faithfully copied from it by a descendant decades later, remains one of the only primary sources historians have ever been able to point to with any confidence in reconstructing what actually happened on that ranch. There is a particular account recorded by a local pastor in his own private papers and later donated to the same regional historical society that holds fragments of the rancher's journal, describing a Sunday service in the winter of 1883, during which the pastor felt compelled, against his own better judgment, to address the disappearances directly from the pulpit, not to offer an explanation since he had none, but to caution his congregation against the growing tendency among some families to keep their sons and husbands home entirely rather than send them out to work the surrounding ranches. He worried, he wrote, that fear itself was becoming as damaging to the community as whatever was actually causing the vanishings. Since families who kept their men from working lost income they desperately needed in a region where alternative employment was scarce. It is a small human detail easy to overlook among the larger facts of the case, but it captures something the drier historical record often misses. An entire community, not just one ranch, living for years under the low, constant pressure of an unsolved and worsening mystery, forced to weigh real economic survival against a fear they could neither prove nor dismiss. Where do you think you'd have looked first? The ground or the men around you? Tell me your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story is traveling. The years 1883 and 1884 were, by every surviving account, the worst of it. 12 more men disappeared across those 24 months, nearly one every month, a pace so relentless and so specific that it made it impossible for even the most stubbornly skeptical neighbor in the county to keep calling it coincidence. Word had spread well beyond the immediate area by this point. Newspapers as far as Fort Worth had begun running short, speculative items about the vanishing ranch, usually buried on an inside page beside livestock prices and railroad schedules, treated as a curiosity rather than a genuine crime story, but read and remembered by families across the state who had sons or brothers working ranches they hadn't heard from in a while. The rancher had, by now, spent a considerable portion of the fortune he'd spent 2 decades building on searches, on hired night guards patrolling the bunkhouse perimeter, and on a reinforced fence line along the northern boundary that some of the hands, darkly and only half joking, had started calling the deadline, a term borrowed, whether they knew its origin or not, from the language of prison camps, meaning the line beyond which a man would not return alive if he crossed it. He tried nightly head counts, gathering every hand at the bunkhouse before dark and again at sunup, a practice that added hours to an already brutal workday, and that more than one hand grumbled about, but none dared refuse. He tried pairing men in twos for any work anywhere near the northern range, a policy that cut his available labor for that section roughly in half and made an already difficult stretch of ranching even less efficient. And he tried, briefly and at considerable expense, hiring a private investigator out of Fort Worth, a man who specialized in missing persons cases for the growing number of families writing increasingly desperate letters to newspapers and local sheriffs asking after sons and brothers who had gone west to work cattle and simply stopped writing home. The investigator spent 6 full weeks on the property, interviewing every hand still working there, reviewing the rancher's own journal entries, and walking the northern range personally on multiple occasions despite the reluctance of the men assigned to accompany him. He left with a single, carefully worded conclusion, recorded in a letter that survives today in a regional historical archive alongside several other papers from the case. He believed the disappearances were most likely the work of a person or persons unknown who understood the ranch's daily schedule intimately enough to know exactly when a given man would be alone and precisely where. This was, in other words, the first serious and formally documented suggestion that the culprit behind the vanishings might not be the land or fate or blind coincidence, but someone with genuine inside knowledge of the operation. Someone who ate at the same long table in the bunkhouse, slept under the same roof, and knew which moonless nights would offer enough cover to work unseen and unheard. It is a theory that unsettled the rancher more deeply than any ghost story the older residents had ever told him, because it meant, if true, that he had been sitting across the dinner table from a killer, or at the very least an accomplice to one for years, without any indication of it, trusting a man, paying a man, perhaps even liking a man, who was quietly responsible for the disappearance of nearly 24 others. He began, according to his own journal, to watch his remaining hands differently after the investigator's letter arrived, noting who volunteered eagerly for solitary work, who seemed unbothered by disappearances that visibly shook everyone else, who asked too many questions about the search efforts or too few. By the spring of 1884, morale on the ranch had effectively collapsed under the weight of 5 years of accumulated dread. Men quit not because they had received a better offer elsewhere down the trail, the ordinary and respectable reason a cowhand left an outfit, but openly, plainly, because they were afraid. An admission that took considerable courage for men who had built entire identities around a culture of frontier toughness to make out loud in front of other men, without shame. The rancher, unable to fully staff an operation that size even with wages raised twice in 18 months to attract replacement labor, began losing cattle to simple neglect nearly as fast as he was losing men to the mystery consuming his property. His operation, built with 2 decades of careful decisions and reckless early bets, was being dismantled not by any single dramatic event, but by absence itself, one man at a time, the slowest possible kind of ruin. And then, in the grim final tally recorded in his journal for the year 1884, the running total of missing men reached 26, nearly the full number the case would eventually be remembered for, with 4 more still to come before the story took its final, stranger turn. It was during this same stretch, in the late summer of 1884, that the rancher made what his journal records as his most desperate decision yet. He wrote directly to the Texas Adjutant General's office, requesting that a detachment of rangers be assigned to the property on a semi-permanent basis, at his own expense if necessary, to patrol the northern range and, if possible, finally uncover whatever was responsible. The request was, by the standards of the era, extraordinary. Private ranchers simply did not command state law enforcement resources for a case with no confirmed crime, no suspect, and no body. The response he received, preserved among his papers, was polite but firm. Without evidence of foul play, the Adjutant General's office could not justify diverting a ranger company from active duty along the border and in more populated counties to patrol empty grassland on the strength of rumor and a rising body count that remained technically only a labor statistic. The rancher's reply to that letter, never sent but found later folded into the same journal, reportedly asked a single bitter question. How many men needed to vanish before a number stopped being a statistic and became a crime worth the state's attention? No answer to that question survives, because none was ever given. In the absence of state help, the rancher turned to a resource closer to home: the families of the missing men themselves. Several had, by this point, written to him directly, having exhausted every other avenue for information, and rather than deflect these letters as many employers of the era might have, he answered everyone personally, copying his replies into the back pages of the same journal that recorded the disappearances. To Curtis Boyle's mother in Georgia, he wrote that he had personally walked the ground where her son was last seen and would continue searching for as long as he owned the property. It was, by any measure, more than the era or his position required of him, and it suggests a man who had come to feel the disappearances as a personal failure rather than simply an operational loss, however much his ledger-keeping instincts tried to frame it otherwise. On a cool, overcast morning in March of 1885, a hand riding the eastern fence line, one of the newer men, hired only that winter, and therefore one of the few not yet worn down by 5 years of accumulated dread, spotted a figure walking up the long main road toward the ranch house. He was moving slowly, unsteadily, dressed in clothes so worn and sun-bleached that the hand's first assumption was that he was looking at a drifter or a beggar, not someone connected to the ranch at all. It was only as the figure drew closer that the hand recognized him, with a shock that reportedly nearly knocked him from his saddle. Thomas Ellery, a ranch hand who had vanished 19 months earlier while riding out to check a water tank on the northern range, a man everyone on the property, including the rancher himself, had privately given up for dead sometime in the 2nd or 3rd month of his absence. Ellery was alive. He was thin to the point of gauntness, his skin sun-damaged in a way that suggested prolonged exposure rather than recent injury, and profoundly disoriented, but physically intact in every way that mattered. There were no visible wounds on his body, no scarring consistent with restraint or physical abuse, no evidence of the kind of sustained trauma one might reasonably expect from 19 months of captivity at the hands of another person. His hands were not bound, had not recently been bound, and showed no calluses inconsistent with the ordinary ranch labor he'd performed before vanishing, an oddly specific detail the doctor later noted, since a man forced into 19 months of different physical labor might reasonably be expected to show it in his palms. When they sat him down in the ranch house kitchen, gave him water and then broth, and asked him the only question that mattered to every person in that room: "Where has he been?" Ellery looked back at them with an expression the rancher later described in his own journal, in a rare moment of literary reach for a man whose entries were otherwise terse and businesslike, as a man staring into a room with no lamp. He did not know. He did not know where he had been for 19 months. He did not know how he had survived, what he had eaten, where he had slept, or how he had found his way back to a ranch whose name, when spoken aloud directly to his face by men he had worked alongside for 2 years prior, apparently meant nothing to him at all. A doctor was brought in from the county seat, one of the very few physicians in that stretch of Texas with any formal medical training beyond frontier experience, treating gunshot wounds and broken bones. His examination, according to surviving correspondence between the doctor and a colleague in Fort Worth that historians have since recovered from a private family collection, found no injury whatsoever to Ellery's skull. No fracture, no scarring, nothing that would explain memory loss through the physical trauma the era's medicine understood best. It found no signs of the kind of illness or prolonged fever that period medicine associated with memory disruption, and it found no indication of alcohol dependency or the use of opiates, both reasonably common on the frontier and both capable of producing the kind of disorientation Ellery displayed that might have offered an easier, more conventional explanation for the gap in his memory. The doctor's official written opinion, remarkable in its honesty for a professional who surely felt pressure to offer some definitive answer to a family desperate for one, stated plainly that he had no medical explanation for what he was looking at. Ellery lived for another 11 years after his return, eventually relocating to a town roughly 60 miles from the ranch, where by every surviving account, he built a quiet, ordinary life working odd jobs, first as a store clerk, later helping run a small livery. And by every account available to researchers, he never once regained a single memory from those 19 missing months, not even fragments, not even in dreams that he described to his family. He married within 3 years of his return, had 2 children, and told them, according to a descendant interviewed decades later for a regional oral history project focused on frontier-era Texas, that the only thing he could ever recall from that entire period was a single recurring sensation. Not quite a memory, he insisted, but a feeling, a physical sensation that would sometimes wash over him unprompted for the rest of his life. The sensation of walking, just walking steadily, for what felt like an impossibly long time, towards something he could never picture, never name, and never explain to the people who loved him and wanted, more than almost anything, to understand what had happened to him. He never went near the northern range again for the rest of his life, and according to that same descendant, he asked in his final years to be buried in a cemetery on the opposite side of the county from the ranch, a request his family honored without ever fully understanding why it mattered so much to him. There is one further detail from Ellery's return that historians have puzzled over more than any other, buried in a single line of the rancher's journal and corroborated decades later by the oral history passed down through Ellery's own descendants. When Ellery first appeared on the road that March morning, his boots, though worn thin, were the same boots he had been wearing the day he vanished 19 months earlier, a detail the rancher recognized immediately, since he had personally ordered those boots through a mail catalog as part of that season's supply order and remembered the distinctive stitching. 19 months of walking, by any reasonable estimate, should have destroyed a pair of frontier work boots several times over, required resoling, replacement, or reduced them to little more than scraps bound together with wire and desperation. Ellery's boots showed wear consistent with perhaps a few weeks of hard use, not the better part of 2 years. When the doctor from the county seat asked him directly how his boots had survived intact, Ellery reportedly looked down at his own feet as if seeing them for the first time, and said only that he did not know he had been walking that long at all. The rancher, in one of the longer and more introspective passages of his journal, recorded his own attempt to reconcile this detail with everything else he knew about the case. He noted that Ellery's clothing, too, showed far less wear than 19 months of exposure to Texas sun, wind, and rain should reasonably have produced, and that Ellery himself, when asked how he had eaten or found water during his absence, could offer nothing beyond a blank, faintly troubled expression, as though the question itself struck him as strange rather than merely unanswerable. The rancher wrote that he had begun to suspect, without any way of proving it, that whatever had happened to Ellery had not unfolded across 19 months in any way Ellery himself had experienced it. That the time had passed for everyone else on the ranch in the ordinary way time always passes, while for Ellery, something else entirely had taken place. Ellery's return should have solved the mystery. In every reasonable telling of how a missing person's case is supposed to resolve, the survivor coming home is the moment the story ends, the moment families get their answers and the county closes its books. Instead, his return deepened the mystery considerably, because it eliminated the simplest and most comfortable explanations available at the time, while offering absolutely nothing solid to replace them with. If Ellery had been kidnapped for labor, for ransom, or out of some personal vendetta against the rancher, 19 months of captivity should reasonably have left some physical trace on his body. Chain marks, malnutrition beyond what a man wandering alone in open country might produce, some detail of a captor's face or voice buried somewhere in his mind, however fragmented. If he had instead simply wandered off alone in some kind of dissociative or fugue state, an explanation some modern researchers have seriously proposed, he would have needed to survive completely alone in unforgiving, arid West Texas terrain for over a year and a half without access to any of the specific ranching and survival skills he was known to possess, and somehow, at the end of it, find his way back to almost the exact property he had vanished from, despite having no memory of it whatsoever. Modern researchers who have revisited the case in the century and a half since, folklorists working in the 1950s and 1970s who collected oral histories from descendants before that generation passed away, a true crime podcast production team that spent the better part of 2016 investigating archival records across 3 counties, and at least one university anthropology project in the early 2000s examining a broader pattern of frontier-era disappearances across the American Southwest, have proposed several competing theories, none of which has ever achieved anything close to consensus. One theory holds that the disappearances were the work of an organized criminal network exploiting the ranch's remote location and constant labor turnover as effective cover for trafficking men into forced labor, most plausibly into Mexican silver mining operations across the nearby border, a documented and unfortunately real practice during this exact era of Texas history. Under this theory, Ellery's return and memory loss might be explained by an escape or release from such an operation, with trauma and possibly deliberate methods used to keep captured laborers docile and disoriented, accounting for his condition. Though it must be said clearly that no direct evidence has ever tied this specific ranch or any specific named individual connected to it to such an operation, and the theory remains speculative rather than documented. A second theory, favored by a small number of geologists who studied the region's soil and subsurface composition in the 1990s as part of unrelated survey work, points toward the possibility of naturally occurring underground gas seepage in the arroyos of the northern range, a phenomenon that, in rare but genuinely documented cases in other parts of the world, has been shown to cause severe disorientation, memory disruption, and in more extreme concentrations, death in both livestock and humans exposed gradually over extended periods. Under this theory, the 30 missing men might have wandered into a pocket of naturally toxic ground, with most succumbing where they fell, accounting for the total absence of remains and trail evidence, since exposure to open range for over a century would leave little behind for trackers or later researchers to find. While Ellery alone, for reasons that would remain unknowable, found his way out of the affected area before it killed him, his memory the collateral damage of whatever process had claimed the others outright. A third theory, considerably less scientific in the conventional sense, but remarkably persistent in local folklore right up to the present day, holds that the northern range sits at, or very near, a site considered sacred, dangerous, or simply best avoided by earlier indigenous inhabitants of that specific stretch of Texas, long before any rancher's fence line had ever been staked into that ground, and that the disappearances were, in this telling, never truly a mystery to the people who had lived on and understood that land the longest. They were only a mystery to the settlers who arrived generations later without that inherited knowledge, and who therefore had no framework for understanding what they were dealing with beyond superstition, coincidence, or crime. This explanation, while genuinely impossible to verify through the surviving historical record, which is itself overwhelmingly composed of settler accounts, given whose journals and letters happen to survive into archives, deserves to be named honestly here rather than dismissed outright, because a great deal of what settlers of this era labeled unexplained was, in fact, simply unfamiliar to them alone, understood perfectly well by others whose knowledge was rarely recorded or consulted. No single theory among these three, nor any combination of them proposed by researchers over the decades, fully accounts for all 30 disappearances and the singular, deeply strange fact of one man's return. That persistent gap between what we know happened, in bare outline, and what we can actually prove happened, in verifiable detail, is exactly why this case has outlived every single person who lived through it, and why it continues to draw researchers, folklorists, and curious strangers to that stretch of Texas grassland well over a century later. There is a fourth theory, offered more tentatively than the other three, and rarely given serious weight in any formal study of the case, that deserves mention nonetheless because it is the one theory that at least attempts to account for Ellery's oddly preserved boots and his singular recurring sensation of endless walking. Details the other three theories largely leave unaddressed. This theory, advanced almost exclusively by researchers working in fields adjacent to folklore rather than hard science, suggests that whatever happened on the northern range may have involved some form of profound time distortion. Men experiencing what felt to them like a single long walk, but which corresponded from the outside to months or years of absence, with Ellery being the only one who ever found his way back across whatever boundary separated the two experiences of time. It is, by any conventional standard, the least scientifically supportable of the four theories, resting on folklore and a single physical detail rather than verifiable evidence, and most serious historians treat it as exactly that. But it is worth including here, honestly and without exaggeration, because it is the only theory offered in a century and a half of investigation that does not require dismissing any part of the strange, specific, well-documented details of Ellery's return as coincidence or embellishment. What makes this case genuinely difficult to categorize, even for researchers who approach it with rigorous skepticism, is that it does not fit neatly into any of the usual boxes true crime and historical mystery content tends to sort itself into. It is not a simple unsolved murder, since no body was ever recovered and no crime was ever definitively proven to have taken place at all. It is not a straightforward missing persons case, since one man did return, alive and physically unharmed, which almost never happens in genuine disappearance cases of this scale. And it is not a tidy piece of folklore either, since so much of it, the rancher's contemporaneous journal, the doctor's written medical opinion, the newspaper items from the era, the surviving family correspondence, is documented in exactly the kind of primary source material historians rely on to distinguish real events from invented legend. It sits, uncomfortably and permanently, in the narrow space between documented history and unexplained phenomenon, which is precisely why it continues to resist easy resolution. The rancher died in 1901, 16 years after Ellery's return, having never lost another hand from his property after that spring morning in 1885. Whether because the disappearances simply and inexplicably stopped on their own, or because he quietly and permanently abandoned any use of the northern range for grazing or fence work altogether, historians examining his later journal entries still genuinely debate, since the entries themselves become notably sparser and more guarded after 1885, as if he had made a private decision to stop documenting a subject he no longer wished to think about in writing. His journal, still the closest thing available to a primary account of the entire ordeal from someone who lived through every year of it, passed quietly through family hands for 2 full generations before portions of it were eventually donated to a regional historical society in the 1960s by a great-granddaughter who reportedly felt the story deserved to be preserved rather than forgotten along with the rest of her family's private papers. Researchers can still request access to those surviving pages today, though several sections, according to the Historical Society's own catalog notes, appear to have been removed or lost before the donation was made, for reasons no living family member has been able to explain. The ranch itself changed hands multiple times over the course of the 20th century, was eventually subdivided among several smaller agricultural operations in the 1940s, and no longer operates under its original name on any current deed or map. In part, according to at least one former owner interviewed for a regional newspaper feature in the 1980s, because local residents had simply stopped wanting to say the original name out loud, as though the name itself had become inseparable from what had happened there. regardless of how many decades had passed or how many new owners had since worked that same ground without incident. That same former owner, who purchased a portion of the subdivided property in the 1970s without knowing its history and only learned of the disappearances from an elderly neighbor some years later, described in that same newspaper interview a peculiar habit he'd noticed in himself over the following decades without ever quite deciding whether it meant anything. He had never once, in over 40 years of working that land, allowed livestock to graze the section closest to what old maps identified as the original northern boundary, despite it being some of the best grass on the entire property. When the interviewer asked him directly whether he believed anything was actually wrong with that section of ground, he reportedly laughed, said no, of course not, and then added that he saw no particular reason to test the question either, since the grass elsewhere had always been good enough. Thomas Ellery's descendants still live in Texas today, scattered across several counties, and at least one of them, interviewed for a 2019 regional podcast episode dedicated to unsolved frontier-era mysteries, said plainly that his family has never treated this story as folklore, has never softened it into a campfire tale for entertainment the way outsiders sometimes do. To them, it remains simply an unanswered fact about their great-great-grandfather, filed away alongside his birth certificate and his marriage record in the family's own private history. 19 months, entirely unaccounted for, never explained by any doctor, researcher, or family member in over a century of trying, and never spoken of directly by the man himself, beyond that single recurring feeling he described until the day he died. The feeling, and only the feeling, of walking. No government agency at the county, state, or federal level ever formally investigated the case as a single connected pattern, because no single provable crime was ever established to have occurred across all 30 disappearances. And frontier-era Texas simply lacked both the investigative infrastructure and, frankly, the institutional will to treat a slow accumulation of missing ranch hands as anything other than an unfortunate but unremarkable feature of frontier labor. 29 men were, in the end, simply marked as missing during an era when missing was common enough not to require any further explanation from anyone in a position of authority. Only one man ever came back to tell any part of the story at all. And what he came back with wasn't an answer, wasn't even the beginning of one. It was an absence, shaped exactly like one, that has now outlasted him, his children, and everyone else who ever asked him directly what happened. A handful of amateur researchers and at least one credentialed historian working on a broader project about unsolved frontier disappearances across the American Southwest have visited the subdivided remains of the property in recent decades, walking what fragments of the old northern range can still be identified on modern parcel maps. None have reported finding anything. No remains, no artifacts, no trace of the 30 men who once vanished there across 5 documented years. The land, true to its own long history in this story, has given up nothing further. What has survived instead is testimony. A rancher's journal with its careful weather notes beside each disappearance, a doctor's honest admission that he had no explanation, a descendant's recollection of a single sensation passed down like an heirloom, and a name that locals even now would rather not say out loud without a reason. It is worth sitting with what this case actually asks of anyone who studies it honestly. It offers no villain to condemn, no monster to name, no tidy criminal conspiracy unraveled in a final act. It offers instead 30 names, most of them ordinary young men who wrote home to their mothers and expected to collect their wages at the end of the season. And one name that came back changed in a way medicine could not explain then and cannot fully explain now. The historical record does not owe us a satisfying ending simply because we would prefer one, and this case, more than most, insists on that discomfort. It asks us to accept that some ground, for reasons we may never recover, took 30 men and returned exactly one. and that the one who returned brought back nothing but a feeling of walking and a silence where 19 months should have been. If you were standing on that ranch today, more than a century later, and someone who had lived there their whole life quietly told you not to ride out past the old northern fence line after dark, would you listen to them, or would you tell yourself it was only an old story? Tell me in the comments, and tell me your city, because I want to see exactly how far across Texas and beyond it this story still means something to somebody tonight.